Hello everyone. Welcome to Scary Chronicles. I know you've come here to relax and fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, I thought it would be fun if you let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, get cozy, let your worries fade, and let's begin. Story number 1. On one dark, foggy morning, a news station began the daily evening broadcast to Sevier County, a low-population area in the middle of nowhere. It began with a poppy intro song, canned footage of various county locales, and fast-forwarded time-lapses of the weather. When the intro wrapped up, the station's logo appeared briefly on the screen before taking position at the lower left corner. The screen showed footage of the child's home. A wide panning shot of a well-kept front yard covered in yellow caution tape and strobing with red and blue police lights. One small boy, who lived in a very poor home and had nothing better to do besides play with Legos in front of the living room TV, noticed something. "What's that?" the boy asked his mother, who sat in a recliner behind him reading a novel. The mother marked her place in the book and looked around for her glasses that were nowhere nearby, before giving up and squinting at what her son was pointing to on the TV. "What's what?" she asked. "That," the boy said, pointing to the field beyond the child's yard. "What is that?" "A horse field," the mother said simply. The field is a flat stretch of land next to the child's house with only a few salt blocks and troughs spotted around. Even through the static of the TV, wisps of fog and frosted grass are easily visible. Their neighbors had a few horses that walked around that field all day. "Not they it," the boy said, then pointed to a specific spot in the field. "That?" The mother shrugged, took another doomed look for her glasses, and searched the screen again. For 1 second, she thought she could see a rough shape in the mist at the far end of the yard. Before she can get a closer look, the screen goes back to the newscasters. "I'm sorry, bud. I didn't see anything." The next morning, the Sevier County News intro kicked off at 7 a.m. with the same canned footage of rolling clouds and cheaply animated logo. The newscasters wear inexpensive clothing and shuffle empty papers on their table. "Good morning, Sevier County. This is James Bergeron and Dash. Audrey Rasmussen here to give you a quick morning update before the day's scheduled programming." Kicking things off, Audrey continued, "And as you've probably noticed, a heavy fall-time fog has set in around the Sevier County area. Though fog is common this time of year, in some areas it's thick enough to stop traffic. Local meteorologist Jason Whitman, says James, has informed us that due to the cold weather and thickness of the fog, it may not dissipate until later in the week. All residents should travel with caution, including using your headlight brights and walking with reflective material." For a brief update on the ongoing investigation into the suicide of Madeline Childs, we have Kenna Spears down for a brief interview with Richard and Evelyn Childs at Maylene Elementary. The image cuts to a young lady in a PBS Channel 3 sweater standing in front of Maylene Elementary. Behind her is a thin, tired-looking man with unkempt hair, a 5 o'clock shadow, and heavy shadows under his eyes. He lightly holds a little girl by the shoulders. The girl is the spitting image of her father, the only difference being even more pronounced shadows under her eyes. While the reporter is very well lit by the news camera's huge lights, the two behind her are almost shapes in the darkness until the light is swung towards them. Only one child in the county is watching the live report, a young girl home with a bad cold. Why are they doing this? She thinks as she bundles into her blankets and pillows and watches the TV in her room. That girl looks so sad. Kenna Spears, on her 4th day of what she thought was going to be a fun and exciting internship, starts her report. "Good morning, Sevier County," Kenna Spears says, smiling a wide smile that looks extremely out of place. The fog is so thick that the world outside of the intensely bright camera light seems to be entirely in inky purple. The only outlier is a row of classroom windows behind Richard and Evelyn filled with dim light, but even those are so distant and non-penetrating to the fog that they look like phantom gaslights. "I'm here with Richard and Evelyn Childs," Kenna says before slowly walking with the camera towards the two. "Husband and daughter of Madeline Childs." Richard winces. Evelyn frowns. Kenna either doesn't notice or doesn't care. Dropping to one knee, she speaks to Evelyn while holding a large microphone close to the child's face. "Evelyn, how are you doing?" she asks with a wide smile still on her face from what could only be a very warped sense of professionalism. "All this fog is pretty creepy, right? What a day to come back to school." Evelyn smiles a little and nods. Richard rubs her shoulder lightly. "We just wanted to say that we're glad to see you doing well," Kenna says after an awkward pause. She's about to say more before Evelyn abruptly turns to her father, hugs him, and runs towards the school. The sick girl bundled in blankets at home smiles, happy that the girl got away. Kenna Spears frowns, resets her faux broadcast smile, and approaches Richard for an interview that the county sheriff had been very adamant to him that he make. Kenna is about to speak when a loud, shrill scream cuts her off. In the footage, those few who happen to be watching see Evelyn running back to her father. The sick girl at home begins to scream as she sees what Evelyn is running from. "It's her." Evelyn screams, over and over. "It's her. It's her. It's here." Richard picks up Evelyn and moves toward the camera's light. It's the only thing even moderately bright and easily visible around. Kenna Spears freezes, too confused and inexperienced to do anything more than stand and stare at where Evelyn had run from. All she, the cameraman, and Richard can see is a vague outline of the school. Except a silhouette in the fog? The adults stare dumbfounded while Evelyn and the sick girl at home scream. "What is?" the reporter asks. She approached the silhouette. Before she could get close, the form in the fog abruptly moved, the mist quickly billowing towards Kenna, before the reporter was lifted off of the ground. Kenna's thoughts were not coherent. All she could be aware of were what felt like fingers as cold as ice around her throat. The pressure tightened harder and harder, until she could feel an explosion of pain, blood, and collapsing trachea in her throat. There's a flash of unbearably intense pain. Then Kenna is on the ground. People are screaming and running. The one light in the fog topples over and the camera crumples. Both the footage and the light cut off and everything is dark. Kenna barely notices. She's trying desperately to take breaths through a shattered throat. She feels her chest soak in a warm liquid and wonders what it could be. The cameraman appears, yelling, trying to tell her something as he hovers over her, looking terrified into their surroundings. Something was surrounding them, but all Kenna could see was fog. Before she can see what the cameraman is looking for, Kenna Spears loses consciousness and dies on the 4th day of her exciting new internship. The cameraman does not notice. At the moment of her death, the same icy cold fingers wrap around his throat and drag him, kicking but unable to scream, deeper into the fog. In the next few hours, the entire town of Maylene went into lockdown. A few bodies belonging to those unlucky enough to be outside of their homes and around the school that morning, including the sheriff of Maylene and his 2 deputies who had been keeping a close eye on Richard, are unseen in the dense fog. The attack had taken place early enough in the morning so that only 20 or so children were at Maylene Elementary. They had all been quickly evacuated to the library. They'd all waited, but help didn't come. Richard Childs was alone in an empty classroom while Evelyn waited in the library. The room offered no comfort. The minuscule desks and chairs looked odd with the brightness of the lights and the darkness outside. Colorful stickers of various objects with cartoonish eyes seemed to glare at him. Sitting in the teacher's chair and putting his head on the desk, he did his best to ignore everything else and draw 5 pointed stars on a blank piece of paper. Except all that he saw was Madeline. He wanted to be in the library, wanted to be with his daughter, but it was better this way. Better to be here alone than to stress out the kids old enough to recognize the man on the news who had abused his now-deceased wife. Or was she? The thought kept coming back to him. That's what Evelyn had said. It had been her. His mind had already been strained for years. He thought it had snapped after he found Madeline's body sitting against the tree in the front yard, smiling spitefully even in death. "Everything's going to be okay," he told Evelyn as they both sat in their house waiting for the cops to arrive. It was a paper-thin platitude and they'd both known it. He said it again when the sheriff led him to the squad car. The pitying look Evelyn had given him as he was handcuffed made him want to rip his hair out and scream, "To hell with the news cameras and reporters watching." Those promises, the lies, had caught up to him. As he stared into the shifting darkness outside of the classroom window, it made a sort of karmic sense. The lies had replayed in his head since he'd been interviewed by the sheriff. "I love you" had been the first. He'd said it after his and Madeline's first kiss. She'd been expecting it, after all, wouldn't want to disappoint his first love. She'd told the same lie to him every time the fighting had died down, and they lay on the bed or couch. Sometimes she'd even cry to show him how remorseful she felt after treating him the way she did, promising she'd get help and start treating him better. But after Evelyn had been born, Madeline had gotten physical. Richard picked himself up, wiping his puffy eyes with the back of one hand and putting the pencil he'd been doodling with in the other, and left the classroom, deciding that he didn't care how others thought of him. He wanted to be near Evelyn. The stepping of his shoes echoed around him as he walked towards the library. The lights were off, the dark brick hallways seeming out of a nightmare. What if those things, made it into the school? But that was impossible. He and the teachers had made sure there was no getting into the building. Right. Even that much was assuming anything about this situation was logical. At the library door window, he could see that most of the children were collected on a large rug that displayed Earth's continents. A few teachers sat on chairs around the kids, forming a protective circle. Kids and adults watched a tape of Schoolhouse Rock. There were stickers everywhere of flowers, rainbows, and books with large cartoonish eyes that looked haunting in the dim TV glow. Evelyn was at the back with the older kids, and she was the first to see him. "Dad," she said, so loud and abruptly that everyone in the room jumped. She was up and running across the room, everyone watching her in stunned silence. She threw open the door and hugged his waist. "Are you doing okay?" he asked, kneeling down to be eye to eye with his daughter. "Not really," she said with heartbreaking exhaustion. "Are you?" "Yeah," he said, hoping it was true. "Miss Clausen wants to talk to you," Evelyn said, pointing to the teachers sitting at a table in the corner of the room. "Okay, sweetie, sit tight." He wasn't sure which one was Clausen at first, until he saw the oldest woman sitting at the far end of a long rectangular table with a particularly harsh glare aimed right at him. She motioned for him to join the teachers at the table. Each of the teachers gave him varying degrees of caution as he found a seat. Some just seemed cautious, most looked outright hostile. Doing his best to ignore them, he sat down and stared at the table, not knowing what to do with himself. He felt all of their eyes boring into him. "Mr. Childs?" asked Ms. Clausen quietly, easily the oldest teacher at the table. She was a beady-eyed and permanently scowling woman that Richard could tell kept as tight a grip on her classroom as she could. "Yes." He did his best to smile, but only barely managed to soften his frown. "Did you kill your wife?" For an instant he was back in the sheriff's tiny interrogation room, the deputies crammed uncomfortably behind the sheriff's desk, all three looking like they'd pulled in a psycho-murderer after a rampage. They'd put him in a small chair against the far wall and made sure to constantly let him know that, no matter what it looked like, he had been free to leave at any time. "No." The teachers all glanced at each other, as if a bit surprised the homicidal maniac they'd built in their heads could speak. He supposed this was fair. He hadn't spoken to any of them when they'd been making sure the school's doors were locked. "Did you beat her?" Another teacher, this one a man in his late 30s, asked very timidly before remembering that he was supposed to be acting as an adult parental figure before less timidly adding. "The news said there were bruises, Dad." "Bruises on her wrists and shins," Richard finished. "She left a lot more bruises on my gut and back from the effort, I promise." "Why was that?" Clausen asked. He could feel the tendons on his neck stretch as he bit his tongue, anger flooding into his veins as he remembered everything Madeline had done. The anger wasn't even towards the teachers or the sheriff and his deputies when they had asked, it was towards himself. "She liked to fight," he said when he'd relaxed himself. Clausen held her gaze. "Care to explain what you mean, Mr. Childs?" "No." The teachers all shared shocked glances. This whole thing was starting to prickle his nerves. "Look," he said, "I just wanted to make sure everyone was all right. I sure as hell didn't come here to get interrogated again." "Mr. Childs," Clausen said, her face softening just enough to show Richard that behind the gruff, stern exterior was an old woman who was desperately tired and scared for the children in the room. "We just want to make sure you aren't a risk to the children." It was clear that some of the teachers, specifically the prissy young man who'd spoken up earlier, still weren't convinced that he wasn't a threat. That was fine with Richard. He didn't give a shit what they thought. "That only leaves me with one question, Mr. Childs," Noreen said, rubbing her eyes. "Do you have any idea what in the Sam Hill is going on?" "No," he answered honestly. It was still hard to believe anything that had happened was real, but he'd seen the reporter's throat bulge as something lifted her from the ground. And what Evelyn had said. "It's her." My daughter says she saw it, he said. Whatever did that to the reporter? She said the thing looked like her mother. I believe her. Stunned silence. That's insane, the young male teacher said. You're insane, Mr. Benson, whispered Mrs. Clausen, so sharp and so loud that most of the kids glanced toward the adults at the table. Mr. Benson squirmed into his chair. Richard had thought Clausen's eyes had been beady and penetrating before. Now they were sharp enough to make the most behaved college senior wither. You forget, she continued, much more quietly, that I saw the murder happen myself. That before the murder happened, some of the kids were talking about adults walking around the school that none of the teachers could see. Do you doubt me? No, Noreen, Benson stammered. I just don't think it's logical to Benson, Clausen said. You said you were the only one to see what happened to the cameraman. Is that still true? Benson went pale, so pale that Richard thought that all of the blood might have drained out of his face. Putting that aside, Clausen said very pointedly towards Benson, who shrank even farther back into his chair, we need to find a way to contact the authorities. It's clear they Richard felt something at the very edge of his senses. A feeling. The others at the table must have heard it as well. They'd all gone quiet and pale with quizzical looks on their faces. Richard turned in his seat to get eyes on Evelyn. She was looking towards the windows. All of the children were. The light of the TV cast shadows around their faces as they looked, as if wearing dark masks to hide their terrified expressions. Ghosts, an older child near Richard whispered. Like white statues. The younger children began to cry. Outside, several shapes had begun to move through the fog towards the windows. The mist clung so tightly as they moved that a myriad of human silhouettes could be intuited. At the front, moving very fast and energetically between the windows and foggy figures, was Madeline. Richard didn't know how he was sure. Maybe the wisps trailing her figure in the fog was just distinct enough for him to tell the shape of her. Regardless, he was sure. That was her. Mom. Evelyn. She stood next to him, looking at the figures. The animated figure stopped, and Richard thought he could see its head move toward the sound of Evelyn's voice. Why? Evelyn asked. A puzzled look. Not only from Evelyn, but also from some of the kids nearer to the windows. That doesn't make sense, Evelyn said. I thought you said . Evelyn reached towards the glass as she spoke. Richard was about to stop her when the windows exploded. Everyone in the room screamed. Richard threw himself in front of Evelyn, tried to tell her to run. Warm fingers closed around his throat, cutting off his words. The teachers rushed to push the kids against the furthest wall in the library. The kids were still screaming so loud that Richard couldn't hear himself think. From his right, Clausen and Benson ran to him, throwing their weight into whatever held Richard. Both crashed into the invisible figure like a wall, the grip around Richard only getting tighter. At one point, he saw Benson jab at the thing with a very sharp pencil. It exploded uselessly. A few of the other teachers fell onto the invisible thing choking him, but each of their blows bounced off. Richard remembered his own pencil that he'd put in his pocket earlier from his time in the other room, collecting himself. To hell with it, he thought. Even if it was a useless effort, he wasn't going down without a fight. Not anymore. He gripped the pencil so hard it almost snapped and stabbed it towards the fingers on his throat. The pencil hit its mark and went deep. Cold, unseeable liquid spilled over his hands. Before he could go for another hit, his vision went crazy and his body went weightless. The back half of his body slammed into something hard, knocking what little air was in him out of his lungs. No. When his vision had just barely begun to refocus, he saw something fly out of the windows that had just been broken into. Evelyn screamed as she was pulled into the fog and out of sight. The other figures in the fog followed, all floating silently while the sound of Evelyn's scream faded. The shortest walk to where Evelyn's screaming had trailed off, the teacher's parking lot, was through the combination auditorium/gymnasium. The exit was one he'd locked himself when they'd been sweeping the school when this all started. Why didn't Madeline come through, then? She easily could have if she was powerful enough to shatter the library windows. Was this all a part of her game? Her amusement? Had she purposefully given time for him and everyone else to be terrified and at her mercy before she took him to hell with her? It was likely, he realized as he found the exit and took his first step out into the fog. Even when they'd been kids, she'd lauded any sort of victory she could over him. Back then it had all been in good fun, hadn't it? The mist crawled through the dark doorway behind him. The air was cool, damp, and had an odd metallic taste to it. The drizzle that had been over the town for days was gone, but it had left a very wide, very thin pool of water that covered the entire lot. He couldn't see all of it, but what he could reflected the mist into a gray mirror that lay flat across the lot. His feet almost seemed to be stepping into a void of mist that rippled at his every move. Richard felt he should be scared, but he wasn't. Not at first. His instinct to get his daughter back overrode everything else. It only waved when he saw feet-shaped holes in the water at the very edge of his limited vision. There was a quick motion, more ripples on the water, and then the feet were facing away from him. He could see the black tar-like surface of the lot under the feet-shaped holes. Fear was in him then, rushing back into him as he encountered more and more foot shapes in the water. Whenever any came even slightly into his limited visibility, there would be a quick motion that sent cascades of ripples across the mirror he seemed to stand on, and then the feet would be pointing away from him. There was Evelyn, standing rigid and silent as far off in the fog as he could see. Splash, 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 splash. Something slammed into his back. His vision blurred as his body fell forward and slammed into the ground, his head and stomach slamming hard into the pavement. The air in his lungs was squeezed out of him. Instinctively, he tried to pull air back in, and his throat was met with gravelly rainwater. In a daze, choking and spitting, he raised himself onto his knees. The fog around him was all at once nauseating and hard to get a grip on. It felt like he was in hell. Playing with your toys. Huh, Maddie? He stood, straining his ears for the same splashes she'd caused before. It was almost impossible. Every time he turned his head, the other invisible things turned away, causing ripples and splashes that overtook any of Madeline's, if she was even making any. Splash, splash. Something slammed into his shoulder. She was in front of him now, and easy to track, but what now? She could bleed, even if it was impossible to know what she bled. But how could he get to her and Evelyn without putting his daughter in danger? A shame that our last fight would be to the death. It was probably what she'd wanted. Why she'd done whatever she had done to get an army of figures in the mist to do her bidding. Even if he was going to die, he'd hoped there was a way to be sent off flipping that bitch a middle finger. There was a humor in that he was still playing into her game. Humor. That's it. It was so simple. He laughed. It started slow, forced and horrifying in its own right. He forced a laugh anyway, all of his chuckles almost sounding like sobs. A memory came to him, the looks Madeline had given whenever he went out with co-workers without her permission. The annoyed glances when Evelyn had chosen to be with her father instead of her mother. Even the frown he would see on Maddie's face whenever he found good company, away from her, at family parties. The fake, horrible chuckles started to come out easier. Boy, I tell you, Richard said to himself, if I took my wife to a dog show, I think she'd win first prize. Now he was really laughing. So hard that he thought he wouldn't be able to get air back into his lungs if he tried. There was nothing to laugh at before, but now there was. Whatever the white things were, whatever Madeline had done to bring her and them here, was a fickle, easily manipulated thing that was not only beyond Richard and Evelyn's understanding, but of Madeline's as well. Dad? Evelyn asked, her fear entirely overshadowed by her shock. She was about to say something else when her eyes went wide. She looked around where the ghosts stood in the water. On the other side of the school, Noreen Clausen was finally getting a connection to the police station on her cell phone. Benson was nearby standing with the other teachers in front of the kids, all of whom had been packed into the corner like it was a standard school lockdown. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a few of the kids look towards the windows. None of the figures in the mist had followed them to the room, but Benson's nerves still froze. What is it? He asked. People laughing? One of them said. Benson strained his ears. He heard nothing, but at the very end of his senses, for just a second, he thought he could feel something. Richard couldn't hear laughter besides his own, but like Benson had, he felt them. All of the other white things that had come for him with Maddie, they were laughing with him. Straight ahead of him, two of the footholes turned towards him. Madeline. He watched her take a few steps around the other invisible things, all of who were still facing away from Richard as they laughed. He could picture her looking at what she thought had been her allies, or even just her temporary companions, with bewildered rage. In one last deliciously petty move, he put one hand to his straining stomach and the other pointed at her. By then, he was laughing harder than he ever had in his life. Suddenly, the footsteps were thundering towards him. Every step was heavy and clumsy, spraying water all over the place. A lot of the water hit the invisible white things, and rivulets of water ran down them, giving them shape. His laughter stopped. Richard's hand went to his pocket and back out just in time for his late wife to make contact. The choice for weapons in a school library had been almost non-existent, and why his attack had hurt her when nothing else would remain a mystery to him forever, but it was all he had. 3 sharpened pencils. Again the pencil sank in, and he felt the cold liquid run down his fingers again for an instant before the full weight of her crashed into him, sending them both crashing into the ground. He tried to breathe in, and almost did, before a force that could only have been Madeline constricted and pushed on his entire body. I'm going to die. A part of him was ready to die. That part of him wanted nothing more than to let something that he'd continued to ignore and, in a way, foster, just let him rest. Let him finally be done with everything. Dad. Seeing black spots in his vision, he brought his hands from their awkward angle underneath his back and wrapped them around Madeline's invisible form. Get, he said, his hands gripping her head. The hell, he stood, lifting both of their weights off of the ground, slowly and struggling but surely. Out, he took the second pencil from his pocket and hammered it into the invisible form's throat. It disappeared into her, all the way up to the eraser of my life. With one last effort, he threw her away. Madeline's body hit the ground hard, making a crater the shape of her body in the water. The other foot-shaped craters in the water turned towards Madeline. Madeline raised her arm, the water instantly pooling into the empty space as she lifted it. It fell back in with one last pathetic splash. Evelyn ran into him then, wrapping her arms around and burying her face in his jacket. She was crying too, but quietly, keeping her eyes just dry enough to watch her mother leave for the final time. It happened very quickly. One moment the body-shaped crater was there, then it wasn't, filled with the reflective rainwater that still covered the lot and still filled with dozens of white things, all pointed towards Richard and Evelyn. Then, without a word or sign of any kind, the figures in the water turned away from them and the school, and left. Their steps were silent, and their ripples were many. The image of their craters forming in the water as they walked away and into the fog was one that never left Richard or Evelyn. Story number 2. My mind often comes back to childhood memories. Things that could never be real are vividly imprinted in my mind and etched into my soul. Pale, withered arms reaching out with their elongated fingers, surfacing from a well, slowly creeping closer to a bird perched on the rim till the rotting fingers wrap around it in an instant. A silhouette of a man 7 feet tall, with red eyes staring at me beyond the doorway of my room, when I had forgotten to shut the door after using the bathroom in the night. His breathing labored as each exhale sounded like there was popcorn popping in his throat. I can recall even in the dark the man seemed darker than everything around him, as if his shape was cut out of the space he resided in. A monster looming over me as I woke up on the school bus, being unable to move a muscle, its mouth agape with sharpened teeth, readying itself to swallow me whole, lifeless eyes staring into my soul as my eyes spin in my skull looking for someone to help me. Sitting in a classroom during a lecture while worm-like creatures pierce through the walls, some slimy substance falling off themselves as they push through. There are so many of these memories that revolve in my mind that I could never write them all. But even when they had woken me up in a cold sweat with nail marks indented in the skin of my palms, I could still believe it was all just a bad dream, caused by an overly stimulated imagination of a child. How I wish I could still think of them as nightmares and childhood terrors, conjurings of a cursed imagination. It all had to be fake. They were nothing but childhood fears, so they surely would never rear their ugly faces once more, and I felt relief in that thought. I'm sure most children had seen things that go bump in the night, or at least felt it was there, such as a monster under the bed waiting for your foot to drop down to drag your body under. But as a child grows up, such things leave their minds as wild fantasies that reality would never glance at, and they usually are just that. A cruel fate has taken this thought that gave my mind reprieve and solace from those recollections. And now something that is not myself compels me to write this wretched story, no matter how well I try to resist and plead for my hands to halt. If pressing a blade to my throat and slicing would stop this torment, it would have been done, yet they stop me. They bind me here, shackling my body to a place I once called my refuge. All this place appears as now as my prison and personal hell. There are strings sewn into the fibers of my muscles, propelling me towards an inevitable end. Any resistance is met with overwhelming strength by the puppeteer. Even now, hot breath is on the nape of my neck. Something is closely watching everything I do. It acts as if it wants to be seen, that it wants affirmation from my eyes, yet it doesn't allow myself to do such a thing. I haven't seen what is behind me. The moment my body whips around, there's still a cold breath on my nape. The creature feels familiar. Maybe it just wants to be in my mind. I think they all do. Maybe its goal is to drive me insane. Maybe it observes for the others. Any guess would be pure conjecture. And there is a feeling in the depths of my soul that the real reason it stands behind is worse than any theory crafted by my mind. I'm not used to these arrangements. Yet even after a few days of this insanity, the exhaustion of my mind is considerably dulled to the fear that was held in my heart when all this started. I was finally happy, you know. Most of my life was experienced in solitude. Connections with people were daunting, but life had started to appear less grim in my eyes. A ray of light entered this life of mine from a chance encounter when we bumped into each other while I was at work. One thing led to another, and we went on a date. A date turned into 2, then 3, then more than I could count. We got along well. She was able to put up with my quirks, and she was someone even a freak like me could be comfortable around. The feeling of comfort she radiated was never experienced, even from my own family. Everything was a wonderful dream in which there would be no one to wake up from. Yet that light vanished, disappeared in a heartbeat. It's when my everything was ripped away, all the meat of my life and soul flayed off by a malevolent force. Some things aren't explainable. Have you ever seen something so out of place that you are utterly baffled by what you see? And if you were to see something your mind couldn't comprehend, what would you do? The answer for myself became painfully obvious to me now. I would just stare, unmoving, speechless. My wife and I were having a midnight walk like we often had. It wasn't dangerous where we lived, and we enjoyed the scent of the midnight air, the contrast to the day making it ever more alluring. There was something calming about the empty roads illuminated by street lamps, all the lights of houses and most signs of life gone to rest. My hand in hers as we chatted about whatever we could come up with, and never seeming to run out of topics to discuss. That night was supposed to be like any other night. It was going as expected until we saw the newly built playground in our neighborhood. In the dark there were children. From their stature they looked to be no older than 8 years. As they played on the equipment, I could hear little quiet laughs echoing around. The laughter felt close, like it was in my skull, yet also distant. At that time, what the children were doing eludes me, as they were not what my eyes had affixed themselves to at the time. Something difficult to describe filled my vision. Even now a splitting headache surfaces when trying to remember. But my will alone is not enough to suppress this ardent desire to write which isn't my own. The being had the shape of a large deformed dog. At least that was the shape of its silhouette. It was illuminated by a streetlight, yet even under the light its shape seemed to be constantly shifting. Its shadow was the only thing that stayed consistent. The creature was so black it absorbed almost all light save for one feature that reflected all back, a white mask on the creature's head. There were black ovals on the ivory mask that only emphasized the empty void-like sockets where eyes should have been. I would have observed it for longer in utter awe, but the feeling of my wife's hand slipping from mine brought me back into consciousness. She asked me what I was staring at. My mind was stunned. She had no clue what horrid being beyond comprehension stood before us. How could she not see something that towers over us, that makes the air itself around it dense and cold? Speech refused to exit my mouth to answer her question. It was like my voice was desperate to hide from what lurked outside. She told me she wanted to ask the kids on the playground what they were doing out at night like this. Oh, how I wanted to stop her. I wanted to scream at her to run, or to grab her hand and take her back to our home, pretending this was all a bad dream. However, what I wanted to do had no bearing on what my body would do. This body of mine stood motionless. There was cement on my feet and hands, as well as a muzzle on my mouth, and something akin to a scratchy liquid filling my throat. I watched in terror as she walked into the field. My eyes gazed ahead and saw the children once more, or what should have been children. Upon closer inspection, their bodies weren't alive. Their bones were broken and jutting out in grotesque ways, and their skin was rotting away, turning into a rancid black sludge, yet still sticking to the bones. The kids played on the equipment as their joints moved in unnatural directions. I frantically looked at my wife, who kept moving closer and closer to them, hoping she would sense something amiss and fall back to me. Thinking back on it now, they were so far away, and my vision was never that good. Their appearance shouldn't have been known to me. It was as if imagery of them were engraved in my mind's eye, worming its way into a place where it could dwell. My wife moving towards them had me momentarily forget the biggest threat, and when it came back to the forefront of my mind, panic overwhelmed me more than it had ever done before. Moving the only thing I could move, I looked at the creature, hoping, no praying, that it would ignore who was walking near it. To my horror, it was staring intently at my wife. Black substance dripped from the bottom of the mask like slobber. Large drips fell to the ground, but there wasn't any splash. I don't want to recall this. I don't want to remember. Why must I recall this wretched memory? Why must I continue to write what seems like the tales of a man gone mad? What occurred is something I wish I could have forgotten and have whiskey take my mental faculties away, then next a bullet to provide permanent reprieve. If memory had been taken from me like the others, I may have felt dead, but it wouldn't have been as soul-crushing as the curse of remembrance. The creature began to move towards my wife. The children stopped their act of merrily playing and stared at her with their empty sockets as she slowly approached them. They were like the call of a siren beckoning my beloved closer and closer, all to feed whatever the creature in the grass was. The dog-like creature sped up in an instant. It barreled towards my wife, and all that could be done was to watch in utter terror, with screams of warning wanting to exit my lungs with such ardor that it felt my lungs were bursting. But my mouth was only left agape without the exit of a single breath. The white mask cracked and gaped open, with only a void where its gullet should have been. The creature moved at an ungodly speed where it became just a smear in my vision. Then her being was no more, vanished as if she was never there to begin with. Everything felt futile. I couldn't even move. My eyes had to watch who I cared for most be devoured, as not even my fingers could move. A feeling of faintness came upon me thereafter. I don't know if the creature caused it or if it was the shock, but the thudding sound of my body when it hit the ground and a crack echoed in my mind as I faded from consciousness. When my eyes had opened up, sticking to Sandman dust that was on my eyes, it became apparent to my horror that it was now day. Jolting up with eyes wide, it became known to me that the creature and children were gone. My body, no longer held down by an invisible force, leapt up and darted to the playground for anything that might have been dropped or would have given a sliver of a clue as to what happened last night. The amount of time that passed searching for clues gone and went into the blue. I combed through the grass, checked every piece of equipment, and even dug through the sand for hours. Some people passing by gave me strange looks, but it didn't matter. The place where the creature under the light stood had nothing either. There was not a hint of its existence. The grass didn't even look disturbed by something that should have had enough weight to leave dents in the ground. My face was buried in my hands as I thought of what to do next. How could I explain what occurred to anyone? It'd be like the ramblings of some crazy. Maybe if they heard my explanation, they'd think it was me who had killed her. Then it would be an impossibility to find her. So many thoughts rushed into my head. They were loud, deafening. My next step eluded me. Laughter bellowed out of me. All the fear and anxiety had me in hysterics. It felt like something snapped in my mind, and an overwhelming sense of shame overcame me for laughing in such a situation. Tears streamed down my cheeks as the laughter continued. What kind of cruel joke was this when life finally began to have meaning? My lungs burnt and my vision blurred from the fit of laughter. My head felt light as I collapsed once more. My eyes opened and my head felt fuzzy. It was a moment of bliss and ignorance before memories rushed back to me, and remembering almost sent me into another fit. Sitting in the sand of the playground for some time, my mind attempted to process all the nonsensical information in what I had hoped to be a calm manner. I wanted to call the police, but the chance of that successfully working seemed so slim, so the only thing that seemed reasonable was to go home. Then I'd try to contact someone. I walked down the streets, my head cast down in shame as I followed the path we walked together only last night. My body swayed back and forth like a drunkard, and almost all vigor had left me. The house was almost within reach after some time, the thoughts of last night replaying in my mind the entire way. The effort to move my body up steps of the house was monumental. A momentary thought slipped into my mind as I slid my key into the door, imagining that she would be waiting there. Wondering why her husband was wearing such a downcast expression, she'd offer her open arms for an embrace to cure whatever disease was in my mind. Yet when the door clicked and opened, it was dark with the curtains shut from last night, and not a soul was present. I pressed the switch by the doorway and the lights flickered to life. My head scanned around, and something in my mind registered everything was off. The first thing that had caught my attention was the color of the walls. Rubbing my eyes and opening them once more only showed me the same image that I thought must have been a trick of the light. Moving closer to a wall by the door, my hands pressed against it. It was cool to the touch. The paint was dry. It couldn't have been new, but it made no sense if it wasn't. When my wife and I had purchased the house, she had wanted to spruce up the place. We painted the walls a bluish gray. She spent weeks deciding on the color. The matter of what color the house should be never seemed that important to me, but she was so adamant on picking just the right one, and it was a pleasant time seeing her so excited. We spent a good few weekends painting the entire house after her decision on the color. I can still recall the blunder that I made when doing cutting. When she saw, she told me it would just add a bit of character to the house that would have us recall this moment. That slight, barely noticeable mistake that held so much importance was now gone, without a trace. Those fond times with her still revolved in my mind. Yet when I stared at the walls of my home, all I saw was a white that made me sick. It was as if what we had done never even occurred. Moving around the house led to more discoveries of subtle and direct changes. Our portrait from a street artist wasn't hanging in the hallway. Her curling iron wasn't sitting on top of the bathroom counter. A side of the bed was missing her stuffed toys. There were so many inconsistencies that it made a chill run down my spine and question if I even went into the right house. The feeling of unease crept up on me. It was my abode. Yet everything changed to the point where it felt like rummaging around in a stranger's place. My head was full of thoughts and it all felt jumbled. It was pointless looking anymore, so I made my way to the living room for my body and mind to have a breather. The couch was different too. But too many thoughts were already revolving around that the thoughts slipped away as quickly as it entered. My head leaned back on the cushion and just stared at the ceiling. Even the ceiling was different. The popcorn roof which we had removed was back once more. It really seemed that any evidence of her living in this house vanished into thin air. I stayed seated on that couch for so long, wondering what could be done in this situation which reality should have never humored. Thoughts slowly began to organize, and my first action was decided. I wanted to talk to her parents. They knew me, they would believe me. Reaching my hands into my pocket, I pulled out my phone. The screen apparently cracked from the fall in the field. A slight feeling of annoyance bubbled up when I went to press my finger to the screen and it caused my finger to bleed. Ignoring the new blood on the phone, I pressed on the phone icon at the bottom bar. The app opened, but it was affected like the house. Her parents' numbers were removed from my phone as well as many others. Looking at the list of contacts, I noticed her number was gone as well. Another knot tied itself in my stomach when I saw her contact completely missing. Panicking, I dialed her number, but all I had gotten was a response saying the number wasn't in use. Frustration kept piling onto me and things kept looking bleaker. My phone moved through the air before my mind had even registered that I had thrown it. It made a thud as it hit the floor. The feeling of needing to talk about her to someone rushed like a tidal wave. There must be someone to contact. However, most of my connections were from her, and they all had seemed to be gone without a trace. Blank spaces on my screen where their names used to be were the only things remaining. Sitting there in silence, I racked my brain to try and find a solution. Maybe there was a simple solution that I was overlooking. Ideas rushed in my head until an epiphany came. It would be hard to contact someone, but if they were in a place I already would go to, it would be easy to meet them. At that moment it became clear what my next move would be. My wife often spent time with a coworker of mine. If I just met with her tomorrow, I could see if the rearrangement of my house and phone were the only things that changed. It was naive to think it was just the house and my device that were altered, but I was so desperately clinging to anything that would create even a thread of hope, a lifeline out of the situation from hell. There was nothing else I could do waiting for the next day to come. Wanting that day to come more than anything, I decided to try and rest. My feet dragged along the floor as I shuffled to the bedroom. Once my head had hit the pillow, I would like to say I fell asleep, but memories of the prior night tormented me to no end as I tossed and turned. Dawn had come after what felt like eons. Giving up on the idea of sleep, I resolved myself to ready myself for the day. Thoughts felt blurred and balance non-existent, as if I spent the night drinking. I thought it had to just be stress wearing me down. It made sense at the time. I swung my feet over the bedside and attempted to stand up. My legs buckled as soon as my body went upright and I fell down to the floor. Every muscle was exhausted. Even moving a finger was almost too much to do in my current state. As I sat there on the floor, there was a sensation on the back of my neck. It felt like breath. It was warm and made the spot which it blew on damp. Turning back and seeing nothing eased my mind at the time, as I just blamed it on fever or the body acting strange with sleep deprivation. There was something much more pressing that I had to do after all. There was a resurgence of my energy, if only by a hair's width, after a few minutes, which allowed me to move. With a little energy I now had, I began making my way to the kitchen to steep some coffee to stave off this exhaustion. It was one step after the other, with my full attention being on each step as to not stumble. My body was sluggish, and I doubted in my current state that I could even make it to my work without collapsing. But sleep wasn't an option, so loading my nervous system with enough caffeine to kill an elephant had to do. Entering the kitchen, my body still felt exhausted, but it had seemed to ease somewhat after getting further from the bedroom. My hands shook as I grabbed a cup from the cabinet above the coffee maker. Preparing coffee with enough ease, I then moved to the dining table to take a seat. The coffee slowly dripped into the cup. With it taking so long, I thought it'd be best to begin cleaning myself up while it was being made. Standing up, I exited the kitchen and made my way to the bathroom to freshen up. I thought my coworker might just run away if I looked so disheveled. If a coworker came to me looking like a bat out of hell, I'd probably get out of there as fast as possible as well. While inching towards the bathroom, it felt like gravity became greater, and looking ahead towards my bedroom door created a sinking feeling in my soul. Luckily, the bathroom wasn't past the bedroom. If it was, I'm not sure what I would have done. Pressing the switch in the hall, the light of the bathroom flickered on. The bulbs seemed to be on their last bit of life as they flickered erratically. When I entered the bathroom, my eyes focused on the mirror as I stared at myself in disbelief. The hairs on my head were gray. Creases lined my face to where one would think I aged 30 years. I brought my hand up and ran it down my face. It was rough, and the skin had lost its elasticity. Would my coworker even recognize me? I don't even look like the same person she had talked to last week. Worrying about these things now would be pointless, however. Maybe I could just cover myself up and say I have a cold. Even though I knew it was pointless to worry, I couldn't help but wonder what was happening to me. It wasn't natural. No man should randomly grow old in the span of a day, but it was just another strange thing to add to the list of occurrences. After some freshening up, I grabbed clothes from the hamper. The feeling my bedroom gave off was just too daunting to come closer to now that I became aware of it. The rest of the time was spent drinking cup after cup of coffee, till heart palpitations kicked in as I waited till I could leave. I had grabbed my phone off the floor while waiting. The blood on it was crusted and there was a small dent on the corner, but luckily my throw didn't break it further. I then went back to the kitchen to wait. Tapping my foot on the ground, sitting at that dining room table while absorbed in my anxiety was the only thing I could do. When time for work came, I grabbed my coat, scarf, and toque from the coat hanger by the door. I'd look odd, but at least they wouldn't see the change of my face. The coat was larger, as if I had shrunk. It made me question whether I had the right one or not, but after a few seconds I was sure it was mine. Getting to work went smoothly, fortunately. I entered the building and saw a few puzzled looks, likely wondering why I was covered head to toe. My mind only had one thought: to find my coworker. I looked around at the front of the store, but she wasn't there, so I made my way to the back. Opening the door to the back, I saw her, and my strange choice of clothing seemed to have grabbed her attention. She looked at me for a second and then asked me what I was doing. "Why are you wearing that? It's the middle of July." Oh, I just have a bit of a cold. Thought I could still work, but now that I'm here I'm not too sure. Well, better tell the manager so you can go home already. You really aren't looking so great. She was looking me up and down. My body was shaking from all the caffeine and I was breathing heavily. No wonder why she would say something like that. "Oh yeah, but first, can I talk to you about Sophia?" Sophia? It didn't seem like she remembered. My heart was cracking solely by the tone of her reply. It was like she was talking about a stranger. After a pause, she continued, "The name sounds familiar." She held her head in her hand and her eyebrows furrowed. "It feels familiar, but I'm drawing a blank. I'll contact you later if I remember." I saw her face wince a bit, like something struck her. "Oh man, give me a second, my head's throbbing. I'll contact you later." Yeah, no problem. Just text me when you're up for it." She seemed puzzled for a second before responding. "Why would I have your number? Wait, why did I think I had your number?" The response gave me a glimpse of hope. Maybe memories still resided in her subconscious, even if she couldn't remember. Right now, though, I doubted spilling everything would work, so I just made up an excuse. "Oh, well, we've worked together for a while, so it'd make sense. But no worry, I'll just write it down for you." I grabbed a random receipt from my coat pocket and grabbed a pen on the table. I quickly wrote it down, then handed it to her. "In any case, I'm gonna go back home and rest up. I hope your headache gets better." "I hope so too." With that, I left the building, then drove back to my house. After entering my home, I slammed the door and went back to the couch. Even if they had some underlying memory, their memories of her were removed. They really didn't know her. She really was gone. If I had more energy, I would have gone into a fit of rage, but I was just so exhausted. The effect of the caffeine was weakening, and I just sat there in a semi-comatose state. At one point, I could have sworn I saw worms exiting the walls like they had when I was a child, but they vanished in the blink of an eye. While being in that state, time passed quickly. It was a while before I was snapped out of it by a phone call. Reaching my hand into my pants pocket and looking at the screen, I saw a number that was familiar, but without the name of the contact, I couldn't recall who it was. I answered the phone and a delirious voice seeped out. What did you do to me? The voice startled me, and I regretted having the phone so close to my ear when answering. Right after you asked me that question, that incessant headache started. I left early due to the headache, and when I got home I began to remember. I remembered Sophia, and right when I recalled her is when these things started growing on my body, and I'm seeing strange things in my vision. What's happening? What did you do? I didn't do anything. Something happened, and I just wanted to see if someone remembered her. Well, great for you. Now I'm in deep shit. I tried to call for 911, but the only number I'm able to call is yours for some damn reason. Just get over here. I don't want to be alone. And I'm feeling cold. At the last part of the sentence, her voice sounded hollow, lacking the emotions a human would carry, like she was losing herself. I was worried and knew I had to go. She gave me her address before hanging up, and after putting the coordinates in my phone's GPS, I dashed out of the house. It hadn't taken me long to get to her house by car, 8 minutes at most. When I arrived, the door was slightly ajar and there were no lights visible from the outside. I crept closer to the house but felt an ominous aura emanating from it. But if she was in there and this was all my fault, shouldn't I go in? With some newfound resolve, I headed towards the entrance. The door creaked as it opened slowly, and there was a chill in the air coming from within the house. Moving through the doorway, I found a light switch and attempted flicking it on, but I had no luck. It was dead. So with my phone as my only light source, I turned on the flashlight and continued through the house. There was a thin layer of ice lining the walls, and also some white tendril-like lines lining all sides of the rooms. The chill of the air got worse as I carried on, and the crooked white lines seemed to have gotten more dense and become one in some parts. It was certainly creepy, but there was some allure to it as well. I wanted to touch the walls, but my gut begged me not to, so I obliged. The lines took off to the right to a hallway and then a door. I followed them and entered a small room. What laid before me was a corpse. The corpse was blue, holes perforated its body, and through the holes mushrooms had sprouted. Ice crystals had formed all around the skin, and the white lines poured out from below the body. In that moment I realized what the white lines were. They were mycelium for the mushrooms in the body. I stood there, bending over in an attempt to get a look at the face, but that too was full of holes, and large mushrooms protruded from where the mouth would have been. I stood there in disbelief, and upon noticing the shirt she was wearing, I knew who this was. My co-worker, who I had been talking to only moments before, became this. I began to back away, but the body began to twitch and convulse. It rose to its feet like a puppet, and I could see mycelium from the ceiling holding it up. It looked at me with that face full of holes, its left arm raised, and it made a motion beckoning me over. A gargled sound welled up within it. Help me. Was she not dead yet? If she wasn't dead yet, she would be soon, and there was no way I would touch that. I began to step backwards. When the creature heard the cracking of ice my foot made when I moved, it lunged. I saw mycelium peel off the wall as the body began to hurtle towards me. Its mouth full of mushrooms grew wide enough to where I could see the stalks. I turned around and began to bolt, energy swelling up within me in this do-or-die moment. The mycelium seemed to pulse along the walls, and the ice made it difficult to fully run. Luckily, it made what was chasing me slip as well. I continued to run. I swear I should have been out of the house by then, but the end seemed no closer and my stamina was fading. The creature's stamina seemed unlimited as it never lost steam. My mind was going blank from exhaustion, and my muscles began to ignore my pleas to move. It was at that moment I lost control over my body, and that breath on my neck reappeared. My body began to gain speed, but I wasn't the one moving. My body moved in strides, but it was as if I was watching a movie. I saw it leap over objects, and when it found a window it jumped through, covering my body in cuts. When it exited the house it hadn't stopped. It was like something was taking my body for a joyride. I didn't feel exhausted even with my body moving at breakneck speeds. I looked around and saw so many strange creatures. Creatures that towered over the city patrolled around, and these multicolored scorpion-like creatures moved out of drainage holes. I could see human-like creatures staring me down, some with saliva dripping from their mouths, others with their arms and legs disproportional to their body. Some had no faces, others had eyes floating around their heads. It was like memories of my childhood all over again. I attempted to resist the movement of my body, but it would not listen. I had no energy, and it allowed whatever it was to gain full control. It eventually made its way to my house, with me being its unwilling cargo. The worms that once flashed in my vision and left were now moving through the structure of the house constantly, shifting themselves through the ceiling and floor as well. When I entered my house, I saw where it was taking me, back to my room. the source of a carnal fear that flooded my psyche. It was hopeless to resist as it dragged me there. It sat my body down on the desk in my room, and that was that. I don't know how long I've been like this. It gave me back some ability to move my head and arms, but my legs are still planted in place. If I try and resist its desires, it takes control once more. Things enter this room every now and then, but their strange appearances have become normal to me. They stare for a while before leaving. I don't know what they are doing. It seems my need for food and water have dissipated. I don't know what my body has become now, but I'm afraid to know, so I keep my phone away so I can't see a reflection. After all this time, I'm fairly certain that I'm a tool to spread their influence, sowing ideas of them into the minds of people. How many more people will they take away, I wonder? It's not like they'll be missed. They'll be forgotten like everyone else, and anyone who does remember will simply be new prey. Well, now that I've finished writing, I can't say for sure what will happen next. If I'm lucky, maybe I'll be finished off, but who's to say? I guess I never got to figure out what happened with my wife, and I doubt I ever will. Maybe she was luckily and truly disappeared in an instant, or maybe she became by the creature that ate her. In any case, I'm signing off, and if you ever sees these creatures, these things that must have come from hell, I wish you luck. Story number 3. The fluorescent lights in room 613 never fully turned off. Even at night, they hummed faintly, casting everything in a sickly glow that made the shadows pool in strange corners. I'd been staring at them for hours? Days? Time felt wrong here, stretched thin like old elastic that might snap at any moment. I woke up in this room a week ago. At least, that's what Dr. Evans told me. The first thing I noticed wasn't the industrial smell of bleach, or the metal bed frame bolted to the floor, or even the wire mesh embedded in the window glass. It was the water stain on the ceiling. A sprawling brown shape that sometimes looked like a face when my eyes unfocused. I tried not to look at it directly anymore. I'm pretty sure it blinks. And sometimes when I stare at it too long, the ceiling seems to stretch upwards, the room expanding into a vast, empty space with no walls and no end. But then I blink, and it's just a room again, small and suffocating. They say my name is Jane. Just Jane, like I'm some unclaimed thing that washed up on a shore. Dr. Evans told me this during our first session, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light in a way that made his eyes disappear completely. You've experienced a traumatic event, he said, writing something in that leather-bound notebook he always carries. A break from reality. We're here to help you piece things back together. But what pieces? My mind feels like an empty room, echoing with footsteps that might be memories. Or maybe it's the footsteps of someone outside my door, pacing back and forth, their rhythm as erratic as the beat of my own anxious heart. Every session starts the same way. Do you know why you're here, Jane? And every time, I shake my head, watching his pen scratch across the page. They won't tell me. Not Dr. Evans, not the nurses with their too tight smiles, not even the orderly who brings my medication 3 times a day. You'll remember when you're ready, they say. But ready for what? What could be so terrible that they'd rather let me sit here drowning in questions than just tell me the truth? The medication comes like clockwork. Yellow pills in the morning that taste like chalk and make everything feel slightly off-center. I arrange them on the bedside table before swallowing them. 3 in a perfect triangle, no more, no less. The blue ones at lunch turn the world underwater, and I have to count the bubbles that rise to the surface, making sure they're always an odd number. White ones at night that are supposed to help me sleep but only seem to make the dreams more vivid. Dr. Evans says they'll help clear my mind, help me remember who I am. But lately, I'm not so sure I want to remember. Something about the pills bothers me. Yesterday morning, I noticed dark veins spreading from my fingers up my arm after taking the yellow ones. When I showed the nurse, she said my arm looked perfectly normal. But I can still see them, pulsing beneath my skin like black worms burrowing deeper, forming intricate patterns, perfectly symmetrical. The ward itself is what you'd expect from a psychiatric hospital in the 1960s. Long corridors with flickering lights, a common room where patients gather during the day, and the constant smell of industrial cleaner that never quite masks something underneath. Something metallic. Sometimes I catch myself thinking it smells like copper, like blood. There are other patients here, of course. Mrs. Albright sits in the corner of the common room, her gnarled fingers working endlessly at her knitting. Click, click, click. The nurses say she hasn't spoken in years, just sits there with those milky eyes fixed on nothing. But sometimes when I walk past, I catch her staring at me, a flicker of recognition in her gaze that sends chills down my spine. Emily paces the halls, having conversations with empty chairs, her voice a high-pitched sing-song that sets my teeth on edge. Ms. Davis, the former professor, thinks she's Marie Antoinette. They're all lost in their own private hells, just like me. But at least they know why they're here. The dreams started on my third night. Just fragments at first, flashes of images and sensation that slipped away when I tried to focus on them. A kitchen with white tiles, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, something red spreading across the floor. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs like restraints. In the dreams, my hands are never empty. They hold a knife, a glint of silver in the harsh light, and the blade is always dripping, always perfectly clean. That's when I started noticing things. Little details that don't quite add up. Like how the number on my door sometimes reads 614 when I'm sure it was 613 the day before. Or how the emergency lights in the hallway cast shadows in impossible directions. Or how sometimes, late at night, I hear music. Beautiful, delicate music, like from an old music box. The first time I heard it, I followed the sound down the dark corridor. The emergency lights made everything look green and wrong, and the shadows seemed to move away from my feet as I walked. The music led me to a door I'd never seen before, tucked away in an alcove that seemed to bend the darkness around it. That's when I heard the warning. Just a whisper, right behind my ear. Don't touch it. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back, the door was gone. Or maybe it was never there at all. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my fractured mind. That's when the headaches started. Not normal headaches. These feel like something writhing behind my eyes, pressing against them from the inside. The pain comes in waves, each one bringing flashes of something. A kitchen knife catching fluorescent light. Red droplets hitting white tile. The coppery taste of blood in my mouth that won't go away no matter how many times I rinse. And with each wave of pain, the walls of the ward seem to dissolve, the faces of the other patients morphing into grotesque masks, their voices a cacophony of screams and whispers. I tried telling Dr. Evans about it during our morning session. His pen stopped moving across the page, just for a moment, just long enough to make me wonder what he wasn't telling me. The light caught his glasses again, turning them into mirrors, and for a split second, I swear I saw something moving in their reflection. Something that wasn't in the room with us. The medications may take time to fully stabilize your perceptions, he said carefully, adjusting those reflective glasses. Try to focus on what you know is real. But how can I know what's real when my own body feels like it's betraying me? The black veins have spread past my elbows now, a web of darkness pulsing beneath my skin. Sometimes I catch them moving when I'm not looking directly at them, like they're trying to reach something, or escape something. And when I touch them, they writhe beneath my fingertips, as if trying to break free. Last night, I woke up to find my sheets soaked through. Not with sweat, with blood. But when I turned on the light, it was gone. Just like the door. Just like the veins whenever anyone else looks at them. Just like Emily, who disappeared 3 days ago. No one else seems to remember Emily. When I asked about her, the nurse looked at me strangely. "Who's Emily?" she said, checking my chart. But I remember her. I remember her conversations with empty chairs. I remember how those chairs were always cold. And I remember the sound she made the night she disappeared. Not quite a scream, more like the noise a music box makes when you wind it too tight. The music box. I keep hearing it at night, its melody getting clearer, more insistent. Sometimes I catch myself humming along to a tune I shouldn't know. The other day, I found myself arranging my pills in perfect geometric patterns on my bedside table, just like the limbs of the woman in my dream. Her arms outstretched, her legs bent at precise angles, her head tilted just so. Perfect. That's when I started going to the library. It's small, just a few shelves of medical texts and outdated magazines, but it's quiet and the nurses rarely check on you there. At first, I was just trying to stay awake, to avoid the dreams that kept getting more vivid, more real. Dreams of arranging things, making them perfect. Behind a shelf of psychiatric journals, I found a box of old newspapers. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them, but the headlines burned themselves into my brain. Riverside Ripper claims sixth victim. Female killer targets young women. Music box murderer apprehended. The articles were from 1963. They described a series of murders. 6 women, all found in their homes, posed like dolls around an antique music box. The killer had arranged them carefully, washing away the blood, dressing them in clean clothes, positioning their faces into serene, almost blissful smiles. In each case, the music box was found playing the same tune. A haunting, childlike melody that seemed to linger in the air long after the music box itself had fallen silent. The same tune I hear every night. The last article included a photograph of the music box. Ornate brass and dark wood, with delicate filigree around its edges. I recognized it instantly, though I couldn't say from where. Maybe from my dreams. Maybe from somewhere else. A cold dread crept over me, a feeling of recognition that chilled me to the bone. When I went to put the papers back, I noticed something dark seeping from behind the wall panel. At first, I thought it was just water damage, but when I touched it, my fingers came away sticky. Red. The panel shifted under my hand, revealing a narrow space behind it. Inside was a notebook. Not Dr. Evans' leather-bound one. This was older, the pages yellow and brittle. The handwriting inside looked like mine, but the dates were from 1963. Entry after entry describing the most perfect arrangements, the most beautiful smiles, the most wonderful music. July 14th. The music guided my hands. She was so much more beautiful this way, at peace. Finally. August 2nd. He struggled. It was messy, but the music calmed him. They all find peace eventually. September 10th. 3 this time. A family. They look so happy now, forever frozen in a moment of joy. The notebook fell from my trembling hands. The memories weren't fragments anymore. They were flooding back in perfect, crystalline clarity. Every detail, every arrangement, every beautiful pose. The metallic scent of blood, the feel of cold skin, the way the light glinted off the blade. I remember now. I remember everything. It started with my dollhouse when I was 7. Everything had to be just so. The tiny furniture arranged at perfect right angles. The little family posed in flawless tableaus. Mother in the kitchen, father in his study, children at the table, each one positioned with mathematical precision. If anyone moved them, even slightly, I'd feel this tightness in my chest. This unbearable wrongness that wouldn't go away until everything was perfect again. As I got older, the need for perfection grew. My room was immaculate, books arranged by height and color, hangers exactly 1 inch apart, bed corners folded at precise 45-degree angles. The world outside was chaos, but in my space, everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. The first one wasn't planned. She was my roommate, and she was so messy. Dishes left in the sink, clothes strewn about, picture frames hanging crooked. I tried to fix things while she slept, but she always ruined it. Always brought chaos back into my perfect order. The music box was playing that night. My grandmother's antique music box that I'd wound up to help me sleep. Such a pretty tune. When I saw my roommate's body, sprawled at such an ugly angle, I knew what I had to do. I arranged her perfectly, each limb at exactly the right angle, expression peaceful, serene. Beautiful. The music box played while I worked, its melody guiding my hands. After that, I couldn't stop seeing the imperfection everywhere. All those people, living their chaotic, asymmetrical lives. But I could fix them. I could make them perfect, just like me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The library seemed to tilt and sway around me, the books on the shelves blurring into indistinct shapes. The music box melody echoed in my ears, growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I whirled around to find Dr. Evans standing behind me, his face pale and drawn. "Jane," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to talk." Dr. Evans' grip on my shoulder tightened as the room seemed to ripple around me. The library's shelves flickered like static on a broken screen, and for a moment, I felt like I was falling, but not in my body. It was a deeper kind of disorientation, like my mind had been peeled back layer by layer, leaving nothing but raw nerves. I remember now, I whispered, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. I killed them. I killed all of them. Dr. Evans nodded slowly, his glasses catching the light in that unnerving way that erased his eyes. Yes, Jane, you did. And we've been trying to help you see that for a very long time. The library dissolved in an instant. No slow fade, no gradual dimming. Just a blink, and it was gone. I was in a concrete room. Stark, cold, and brutally real. The walls were bare, save for the faint scratches I'd apparently carved into the surface over the years. Tiny music notes etched in jagged lines. My breath caught as I looked down at my hands. The black veins were gone, the pulsing patterns replaced by pale skin marred with faint scars and calluses. I was wearing a prison jumpsuit. Bright orange, stiff against my skin. Across from me, Dr. Evans, if that was even his name, sat on a metal stool, a thick folder resting on his lap. There was no notebook, no pen, no wire-rimmed glasses. Just a clipboard and a tired, resigned expression on his face. Where's room 613? I croaked, the words clawing their way out of my throat. Dr. Evans didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder, pulling out a black and white photograph and sliding it across the table. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The photo showed a body, posed on the ground in a grotesque tableau, arms and legs bent into inhuman angles. Her face was serene, her lips curved into a faint, unnatural smile. A music box sat beside her, its lid open, though I couldn't hear its melody anymore. That was your first victim, Dr. Evans said softly. Your roommate, Hannah Brooks. You arranged her like a doll in your grandmother's music box. You even left a note, calling her your most beautiful creation. Do you remember that now? I nodded, my stomach churning. The memory was there, sharp and vivid, no longer buried under layers of dreamlike haze. But the room still felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were mocking me. And the others? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Dr. Evans sighed, sliding more photos across the table. Each one was worse than the last. A woman on her kitchen floor, limbs outstretched at geometric angles. A man in his living room, his face turned toward the camera with a blissful smile painted on his lips. A family of 3 arranged around a dining table, their lifeless bodies posed as if mid-conversation. You called it art, Dr. Evans said, his voice heavy. The newspapers called you the music box murderer. Do you remember what you told the judge at your trial? I shook my head, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to remember. You told the court you weren't guilty because they weren't dead to you. You said they were perfect now, that you'd brought them peace. The jury didn't agree. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. That was 12 years ago, Jane. And no matter how many realities your mind invents to protect you, the truth doesn't change. You're not in room 613. You're in solitary confinement, awaiting execution. My pulse roared in my ears, the words hitting me like a physical blow. No, I murmured, shaking my head. That's not possible. I was in the hospital. There were other patients. Emily, Mrs. Albright, the music box. None of it was real, Dr. Evans interrupted, his voice cold now. You've been living inside your own mind, creating scenarios to avoid facing what you did. The hospital was a construct, a way for you to pretend you were the victim. But the truth is, you're here, on death row, and your execution is scheduled for tomorrow morning. I staggered back in my chair, the metal scraping loudly against the concrete floor. No, I said again, my voice rising. I don't believe you. Dr. Evans stood, tucking the folder under his arm. You don't have to believe me, Jane. The clock doesn't care if you accept reality or not. He knocked twice on the heavy steel door behind him. It groaned open, and 2 guards stepped in, their faces expressionless. As they moved toward me, I caught a glimpse of the hallway beyond. Long, gray, and empty, lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Room 613. It wasn't a hospital ward. It had never been a hospital ward. It was my cell number. The numbers bolted to the steel door that had been my entire world for over a decade. As the guards hauled me to my feet, the faint melody of the music box crept into my mind again, unbidden. I hummed it under my breath as they led me down the corridor, each step echoing like the ticking of a clock. Tomorrow, I would die. But as the guards opened the heavy door to the execution chamber, I saw not the sterile gurney I'd expected, but a room full of people. They were all staring at me, their faces familiar. Mrs. Albright, Emily, Ms. Davis, and they were smiling. Story number 4. I have lived in Oregon all 40 years of my life, and I had always been curious about the massive forests all around where I lived. What could be hiding in those trees just out of sight? Such curiosity is how I found myself searching local folklore on anything strange or unheard of in the forests nearby. One day in the fall of 2006, I found myself in a small diner outside of Junction City, a small farming town north of where I lived. I was sitting there drinking my coffee when overheard two older gentlemen speaking to each other at the other end of the bar table. I'm telling you, Bill, I saw it. It was looking right at me. Ah, horse shit, Frank. You were probably drunk knowing you. I swear, Bill, God's honest truth. It was just like the stories your dad used to tell us. My pa was as much of a drunk as you are, probably more. As they continued to speak to each other, I moved down the bar towards them. Excuse me, gentlemen. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Tell me, what did you see? The skinnier of the two, Bill, rolled his eyes at me, but Frank continued. I saw the lurker. He said, excited that someone cared to hear his story. The lurker. I asked, unsure of what he meant. He leaned in close and said, the lurker is a local mystery. It lives in the woods, watching us. He paused and took a swig of his beer. I was out stalking one of the local trails, looking for white-tail. While I was trudging through the brush, I hear a loud cracking sound in the trees ahead. I stopped to see what it could be, thinking it was a cougar or a deer. When I saw one of the trees move as if it turned away from me in that brief moment, I saw two gleaming orange eyes like two burning coals. Bill let out a scoff. More likely you saw someone's tail lights. I know the difference between tail lights and eyes, Bill. Frank exclaimed as he shot his head in Bill's direction. How do you know that it's the lurker? I interjected. Folks been seeing it for years, and it's always described the same way. Frank continued. What did you do next? Nothing. I blinked, and just like that it was gone again, as if it had never been there. Then I made my way back to my pickup and headed back home. I sipped from my coffee as contemplating Frank's tale. The exhilaration of finding something unknown crept up my spine. Where was this? I asked, trying to downplay my excitement. Frank looked at me with a twinge of suspicion in his eyes. Why do you want to know? Morbid curiosity. I'm doing research for a blog on folklore. Frank scratched the back of his head uncomfortably. All right, it was on a game trail out by Fern Ridge. It's not far from a hiking trail that's visited often. I thanked him, paid for my coffee, then left. I was actually familiar with the hiking trail Frank had told me about, so I headed straight there. I arrived at Fern Ridge later that afternoon and made my way down the hiking trail towards the woods. Soon enough, I found the game trail that Frank had told me about. As I made my way through the underbrush, I felt the tingle of my hairs standing up in excitement. The foliage got thicker and thicker as I continued. Suddenly, I lost my footing and fell into the bushes. When I looked down towards my feet, I saw a huge hole that I had slipped into. I got up, brushed myself off, and inspected the hole. It was about 3 feet wide and about 1 foot deep. I was lucky I hadn't really hurt myself. Then I noticed that there was a bunch of loose soil both in and around the hole. It looked like the hole left by a tree being uprooted, only there was no fallen tree nearby. I felt a shiver up my spine. I couldn't tell you why. I shook my head thinking an animal had just been digging in the dirt. But as I looked up the trail, I saw another hole about 15 feet away, and another, and another. If I didn't know any better, I would have said they were footprints. I felt a lump forming in my throat and the sudden urge to follow the trail growing in the back of my head. Against my better judgment, I began to follow the foot trail of footprints. The excitement of finding something truly undiscovered too enticing to ignore. As I continued, a little voice in my head began to implore me not to follow, but that voice was little more than a whisper. Soon, I found the trail lead to a small clearing. The prints stopped exactly where I was standing. I looked around and saw no trace of the prints I looked about and saw that the sun was starting to set. I must have really lost track of time. I turned around, making one last pass at the clearing, when a cacophony of screeches shot up from the trees just to my left. I nearly jumped out of my skin as a murder of crows came bursting from the trees circling the clearing. They flew into the air like a black cloud, slowly spiraling towards the ground, feeling a sudden pull drawing me towards where they were landing. As I made my way closer, my skin began to crawl as I felt the putrid stench of rot in the air. My heart stopped as I looked down. There, laying in the middle of the clearing, was a body, torn to pieces, entrails strewn around like streamers. I turned away, retching up what little I had in my stomach. I pulled myself back up, my eye locked with a dead puffy eye in the shattered remnants of its skull. One of the larger crows landed there, cocking its head at me curiously. It squawked and pecked at the wet puffy eye, pulling it free with a WER sucking sound. It quickly gobbled up the eye. I was too shocked and filled with disbelief to move. The crow tilted its head at me again, and for a brief moment I could have sworn I saw a glint of orange in the bird's eye. It screeched and flew away. As it did, all of my senses slowly returned to me. I felt my arms start to move frantically to my phone. I scrambled to dial 911. A woman's voice immediately answered. 911 helpline, please state the nature of your emergency. Hi, oh God. I'd like to report a dead body. Okay, sir, please tell me your name. I felt my tongue glued to the roof of my mouth as I tried to answer. My name is Kurt Walsh. I'm out off a game trail just off Fern Ridge. I was going for a walk and I found... Oh God, I can't even tell. Ma'am, it's bad. Please, send someone. She tried to calm me down, but all I could do was hear the crows. They began to squawk in a more full chorus. Kurt, I need you to tell me if the officers and paramedics can get to you. The bird squawking grew louder. I clutched my head as my ears began to ring. What? I shouted into the phone. She responded louder. Can the paramedics and officers get to you? I'm not sure. I'm off the usual trail about a quarter of a mile. The birds kept calling out, trying to drown out all other sounds. My ears began to ring louder. The woman's voice was a muffled mess. I felt an ear-piercing yell tear out of my lungs. Shut up. Suddenly the birds all stopped and cranked their heads towards me. There was an uncomfortable silence, made all the worse now that the noise was gone. The crows spread their wings and took to the sky, flying towards the slowly sinking sun. As I watched, I heard the woman. Kurt, are you okay? I placed the phone back to my ear. Why, yes. Sorry, there was a group of crows. They led me to the body, and they were being loud. I'm sorry. She hesitated, then in a soft voice replied. It's okay. The officers are on their way. Can you help them find the body? Yes. I can go off the trail and lead the officers here. She spoke softly over the phone. Okay, would you like me to stay on the call with you until then? I stuttered, my mind still awhir with the sound of the crows and the discovery at my feet. Yes. Please, Miss Liz. She responded softly. My name is Liz. As I walked back to the main trail, I spoke to Liz, explaining why I was out there and how the crows had led me to the body. She spoke softly to me, trying to keep me calm. She seemed sweet and kind over the phone. I would have asked her for more pleasant company, but given the circumstances, I decided now was not the time. As I reached the trail a half hour later, I saw the lights flickering from the officers and paramedics. All right, I'm back at the main trail. Thank you, Liz, for the calming conversation. She spoke softly and said, It's all right, Kurt. I hope you are okay and the paramedics can help you. I felt a pang in my stomach as I knew the conversation was ending. I blurted out, Could I get your number? She chuckled over the other end. Well, this is the strangest way a guy has ever asked for that, but sure, why not? I pulled out my pocketbook and wrote down the number she gave me. We exchanged pleasantries and the call ended. Soon I brought the officers and the paramedics around to the clearing. They began to investigate the body as I told them the whole story. How I had been out there following some tracks, how the crows startled me and I followed them to the body. One of the officers looked at me strangely. He was an older man, maybe in his late 50s. His name badge gleamed in the flashlight. Lesky. You a journo? I shook my head slowly. No, why do you ask? 'Cause it sounds like you were looking for the lurker. I felt my stomach twist slightly. Is there a problem? Lusky slowly adjusted his cap. Listen, kid, people who go looking for old ghost stories usually find nothing but trouble. So do me and my guys here a favor and quit while you're ahead. A new twinge of morbid curiosity tingled up my spine. What makes you say that? He pulled a cigarette from his coat pocket. The last time some city slicker came here to look for the lurker, he wound up dead. His eyes trailed to the macabre-strewn corpse. And it was about as pretty as this. I raised my eyebrows. What are you saying a local legend did this? All I'm saying is that there's something in these woods, and it wants to be left alone. A thin trail of smoke left his mouth as he flicked his barely started cigarette onto the ground, stomping it into the brackish mud. He turned away from me and started telling his men to finish up as the paramedics were almost finished packing up the body. Am I done here? I asked one of the other officers. He nodded to me. If you are feeling well enough to drive, you can head home now. We may call you in for another statement once the coronary report comes in. I nodded, thanked him and turned around to leave. As I slowly made my way back towards the edge of the clearing, I caught something just off the other end. Two gleaming lights, like burning coals. I blinked my eyes and shook my head. They were gone just as soon as they appeared. I shuddered, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. As I made my way back to my car, I couldn't help but shake the feeling I was being watched. Story number 5. There are stories that cling to the edges of reality, rumors whispered in bars by old sailors with trembling hands and distant eyes. Stories of ships that drift into the harbor with no crew, no signs of struggle, just eerie silence. But until last week, I thought they were just that, stories. The Nautica appeared in the mist on a quiet Tuesday morning. No distress signals, and no records of departure. A 70-year-old cargo vessel, long thought scrapped, just appeared. It was found adrift off the coast, slowly floating toward the docks with not a soul on board. No crew, no captain, nothing. Naturally, the news caught my attention. As a freelance journalist, I made a living chasing down stories that could make people question their understanding of the world. And this was exactly the kind of mystery I thrived on. I packed a bag and headed out to the docks, flashing my credentials to get past the growing crowd of onlookers. The police had cordoned off the ship, but even they seemed hesitant to go on board. I overheard two officers talking, their voices low as if the ship itself could hear them. Their conversation was as follows. They sent a team last night. They were supposed to radio back once they checked below deck, but we never heard from them again. No sign of a struggle. No bodies. They were just gone. They think it's another Mary Celeste thing. Maybe we should just let it drift back out to sea. I felt a chill as I approached the Nautica. Even in the daylight, something felt wrong. The hull was rusted, the metal groaning softly as it swayed in the water. But it was more than just the age of the ship. There was a presence about it, like the ship was watching, waiting. I wasn't the only one who noticed. As I boarded, a few dockworkers crossed themselves, muttering superstitious warnings. One of them, an older man with grizzled features, stopped me. You're going on that thing? You know about the crew, right? I nodded. Vanished, right? Like the Mary Celeste? His eyes darkened a bit, but he continued. Not just vanished. There's something else. Word is, they found a logbook. Entries from the captain. It wasn't just the crew disappearing. They were hearing things. They heard voices. Sounds that don't belong on a ship like this. I paused, my curiosity piqued. What kind of sounds? The man hesitated, then leaned in close. The kind that makes you wish you hadn't heard them. That was enough for me. I thanked him and made my way up the gangplank. As my feet touched the deck, I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The creaking of the ship was the only sound. But even that felt wrong, like the ship was groaning under some unseen burden. I moved toward the bridge first, wanting to get a look at the logbook the dockworker mentioned. The door to the bridge was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open with a creak. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, caught in the gray light filtering through the grime-covered windows. The captain's chair sat empty, facing the sea like a sentinel. The logbook was on the desk, its leather cover cracked and worn. I flipped through the pages, scanning entries about mundane ship operations and maintenance, until I hit the last few. October 7th, 1949. Something is wrong. The men hear noises at night. Soft voices, whispers just below the deck. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the sound of the water or the ship settling, but last night, I heard it too. October 9th, 1949. The voices are getting louder. I've ordered the men to stay above deck at night. No one is to go below deck alone. Some of them are saying the ship is cursed, that we've crossed into something we weren't meant to. Nonsense. But I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. October 10th, 1949. 2 men are missing. No sign of them anywhere. I don't know what to do. We've searched the entire ship, every inch, but they're gone. Some of the men want to turn back, but I won't have it. We push forward. October 12th, 1949. I'm the last one. They've all gone below deck, despite my orders. I can hear them down there. The whispers are louder now. They're calling my name. I won't go. I won't go. The final entry trailed off, the ink smudged as if the captain's hand had trembled as he wrote it. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The Nautica's crew hadn't just disappeared. Something had taken them. A sudden creak echoed through the bridge, and I froze. The air felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But there was no one. The ship groaned again, and this time, I swore I heard it. The faintest whisper of my name. Beckoning. I backed out of the bridge, my pulse racing. I needed answers, but there was something I knew deep down. Whatever had happened to the crew, whatever was calling from below deck, wasn't done yet. As I stood there, staring at the rusted metal stairs leading below, the wind seemed to carry that same whisper to my ear again, soft but unmistakable. Come down. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness below. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The same whisper from the bridge echoed in my ears, faint but unmistakable. Come down. The urge to turn around and run was strong, but something held me there. Curiosity, or maybe something deeper, something darker. I wasn't just here for a story anymore. I needed to know what happened to the crew. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. Each step creaked beneath my weight, the sound of old wood and rusted metal groaning in protest. The further I descended, the colder the air became, as if I were walking into the depths of a forgotten tomb. At the bottom of the stairs, the ship's corridors stretched out in both directions, dimly lit by the occasional flicker of a dying light bulb. The silence was absolute. No sound of the sea, no hum of the ship's machinery, just oppressive stillness. The kind of silence that feels alive. I gripped the flashlight tighter in my hand, the beam cutting through the darkness as I started walking. The walls were lined with thick rivets, the floor covered in grime and rust. But something else caught my eye. Faint handprints, smeared in dark red, trailing along the walls as if someone had been dragged. There are stories that cling to the edges of reality, rumors whispered in bars by old sailors with trembling hands and distant eyes. Stories of ships that drift into the harbor with no crew, no signs of struggle, just eerie silence. But until last week, I thought they were just that, stories. The Nautica appeared in the mist on a quiet Tuesday morning. No distress signals, and no records of departure. A 70-year-old cargo vessel, long thought scrapped, just appeared. It was found adrift off the coast, slowly floating toward the docks with not a soul on board. No crew. No captain. Nothing. Naturally, the news caught my attention. As a freelance journalist, I made a living chasing down stories that could make people question their understanding of the world. And this was exactly the kind of mystery I thrived on. I packed a bag and headed out to the docks, flashing my credentials to get past the growing crowd of onlookers. The police had cordoned off the ship, but even they seemed hesitant to go on board. I overheard two officers talking, their voices low as if the ship itself could hear them. Their conversation was as follows. They sent a team last night. They were supposed to radio back once they checked below deck, but we never heard from them again. No sign of a struggle. No bodies. They were just gone. They think it's another Mary Celeste thing. Maybe we should just let it drift back out to sea. I felt a chill as I approached the Nautica. Even in the daylight, something felt wrong. The hull was rusted, the metal groaning softly as it swayed in the water. But it was more than just the age of the ship. There was a presence about it, like the ship was watching, waiting. I wasn't the only one who noticed. As I boarded, a few dockworkers crossed themselves, muttering superstitious warnings. One of them, an older man with grizzled features, stopped me. "You're going on that thing? You know about the crew, right?" I nodded. "Vanished, right? Like the Mary Celeste?" His eyes darkened a bit, but he continued. "Not just vanished. There's something else. Word is, they found a logbook. Entries from the captain. It wasn't just the crew disappearing. They were hearing things. They heard voices. Sounds that don't belong on a ship like this." I paused, my curiosity piqued. "What kind of sounds?" The man hesitated, then leaned in close. "The kind that makes you wish you hadn't heard them." That was enough for me. I thanked him and made my way up the gangplank. As my feet touched the deck, I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The creaking of the ship was the only sound, but even that felt wrong, like the ship was groaning under some unseen burden. I moved toward the bridge first, wanting to get a look at the logbook the dockworker mentioned. The door to the bridge was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open with a creak. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, caught in the gray light filtering through the grime-covered windows. The captain's chair sat empty, facing the sea like a sentinel. The logbook was on the desk, its leather cover cracked and worn. I flipped through the pages, scanning entries about mundane ship operations and maintenance, until I hit the last few. October 7th, 1949. Something is wrong. The men hear noises at night. Soft voices, whispers just below the deck. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the sound of the water or the ship settling, but last night, I heard it too. October 9th, 1949. The voices are getting louder. I've ordered the men to stay above deck at night. No one is to go below deck alone. Some of them are saying the ship is cursed, that we've crossed into something we weren't meant to. Nonsense. But I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. October 10th, 1949. 2 men are missing. No sign of them anywhere. I don't know what to do. We've searched the entire ship, every inch, but they're gone. Some of the men want to turn back, but I won't have it. We push forward. October 12th, 1949. I'm the last one. They've all gone below deck, despite my orders. I can hear them down there. The whispers are louder now. They're calling my name. I won't go. I won't go. The final entry trailed off. The ink smudged as if the captain's hand had trembled as he wrote it. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The Nautica's crew hadn't just disappeared. Something had taken them. A sudden creak echoed through the bridge, and I froze. The air felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway. But there was no one. The ship groaned again, and this time, I swore I heard it. The faintest whisper of my name. Beckoning. I backed out of the bridge, my pulse racing. I needed answers, but there was something I knew deep down. Whatever had happened to the crew, whatever was calling from below deck, wasn't done yet. As I stood there, staring at the rusted metal stairs leading below, the wind seemed to carry that same whisper to my ear again, soft but unmistakable. Come down. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness below. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The same whisper from the bridge echoed in my ears, faint but unmistakable. "Come down." The urge to turn around and run was strong, but something held me there. Curiosity, or maybe something deeper, something darker. I wasn't just here for a story anymore. I needed to know what happened to the crew. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. Each step creaked beneath my weight, the sound of old wood and rusted metal groaning in protest. The further I descended, the colder the air became, as if I were walking into the depths of a forgotten tomb. At the bottom of the stairs, the ship's corridors stretched out in both directions, dimly lit by the occasional flicker of a dying light bulb. The silence was absolute. No sound of the sea, no hum of the ship's machinery, just oppressive stillness. The kind of silence that feels alive. I gripped the flashlight tighter in my hand, the beam cutting through the darkness as I started walking. The walls were lined with thick rivets, the floor covered in grime and rust. But something else caught my eye. Faint handprints, smeared in dark red, trailing along the walls as if someone had been dragged. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The logbook had mentioned the voices. The missing men. The captain refusing to go below deck. I had come here for answers, but now I wasn't so sure I wanted to find them. As I turned the corner, I came across the first door. Its surface was scarred with deep gouges, as though someone, or something, had clawed at it desperately. I reached for the handle, hesitating for just a moment before pushing it open. The room beyond was small, likely one of the crew's quarters. Bunks were stacked against the wall, the mattresses old and worn, but what caught my attention was the layer of dust covering everything. It wasn't just dust, it was thick, undisturbed, as if no one had stepped foot in this room for decades. But that didn't make sense. The ship had disappeared in 1949. How could the dust be so thick, so untouched? Something moved in the corner of my vision, just a shadow, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I swung the flashlight in its direction, but there was nothing there. Just the bare metal walls. That's when the whispering started again. This time, it wasn't just my name. "Why are you here?" The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was close. Too close. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering in my chest. The corridors seemed longer now, darker, as if the ship itself were closing in on me. The handprints on the walls seemed fresher, the dark stains more vivid. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. I had to keep moving. I passed more doors, all sealed shut, some with deep scratches and dents. The air felt heavier with each step I took, the temperature dropping with every passing minute. I kept telling myself it was just an old ship, abandoned and forgotten, but there was a part of me, deep down, that knew better. Something was here. Another door stood slightly ajar at the end of the corridor, and I felt a pull toward it. I stepped inside and found what looked like a mess hall. Tables and chairs were overturned, as though there had been some kind of struggle. Plates, still half filled with food, sat undisturbed on the tables, now long covered in mold. But that wasn't what sent the chill down my spine. The chairs. They weren't just overturned randomly. They were arranged, deliberately, in a circle. And sitting in those chairs were shadows. I blinked, and the shadows were gone, but the impression of them lingered. As if, for just a moment, I had seen something. Someone. The whispering grew louder. "They took us. They took us." I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the room, but no one was there. The ship groaned around me, metal straining under the weight of something unseen, something pressing down on the very walls. I needed to leave. I turned to go, but something caught my eye, a figure just at the edge of the doorway. It was barely visible in the dim light, but I saw it. Tall, thin, watching. It vanished before I could get a closer look, but the air around me grew colder. I raced back toward the stairs, heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I had to get off this ship. As I ran, the whispering followed, growing louder and more frantic. "They took us. They took us. They took us." The voices seemed to echo from the very walls, surrounding me, pulling at me. I reached the bottom of the stairs, breathless, and turned to look back one last time. That's when I saw them. Silhouettes. Figures moving in the dark, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. They were watching me, dozens of them, shifting in the shadows. The crew. The missing men. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hollow. I scrambled up the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. As I reached the deck, the whispering stopped, replaced by the low groan of the ship, as if it had let out a sigh of relief. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I reached the dock, panting and shaken, I looked at the Nautica one last time. The ship was silent again, but I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. And I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened to the crew of the Nautica, it wasn't over. The ship was still waiting, watching, calling. The town felt different when I got back from the Nautica. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, like the world had tilted ever so slightly off balance. I tried to shake it off as I walked home, my head still buzzing from the encounter on the ship. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, what had happened, but I didn't know where to begin. Would they even believe me? The ship's hold, the voices, those figures. I sat on my bed, staring at my phone, wondering if I should call someone. Maybe a colleague who could help me dig deeper. But my hands trembled as I held the phone, and I couldn't stop thinking about the last thing I saw, those shadowy figures moving in the dark, watching me, almost daring me to come back. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers. They took us. They took us. The voice was like a low hiss in my ear, never fading. I would snap my eyes open and stare into the darkness of my bedroom, expecting to see the shadows creeping toward me. But it was just me. Alone. At least, I thought I was alone. The next morning, I decided to head back to the docks. Not to the Nautica. I wasn't ready to face that nightmare again, but to see if there were any new developments. Maybe the authorities had decided to do another sweep of the ship, or maybe more reports had surfaced about its cursed return. When I got there, I noticed something strange. The fog. It had rolled in overnight, thick and gray, choking the town like a blanket of smoke. I couldn't even see the end of the street from where I stood. The dock workers moved like ghosts, their figures barely visible through the mist. The Nautica was still anchored, looming in the fog like a forgotten monolith. It looked different in the daylight, less menacing, almost benign, but the weight of what I had experienced still hung heavy in the air. As I stood there, I felt it again. That tug, that pull. Something wanted me to come back. I turned away, trying to push the urge down, but as I walked through the fog, I noticed it again. The feeling of being watched. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The fog has a way of making you feel claustrophobic, as though it's pressing in on all sides. But this wasn't just a trick of the mind. I could feel eyes on me. I glanced behind me. Nothing but swirling mist. I kept walking, my heart picking up speed as the feeling grew stronger. Every few steps, I would glance back, expecting to see someone, or something, following me, but the street remained empty. The only sound was the distant creak of the docks and the faint hum of the water lapping against the shore. It wasn't until I reached the edge of town that I saw it. A shadow. It stood at the corner of the street, barely visible through the fog, just watching. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, staring at the figure. It didn't move. It didn't come closer. It just stood there. I blinked, and it was gone. I rubbed my eyes, convinced that I was imagining things. Lack of sleep, stress, fear, it was messing with my head. But as I turned the corner to my street, I saw another one. A figure standing at the edge of my driveway, shrouded in fog, staring at my house. And then, like before, it vanished. By the time I got inside, my heart was racing. I locked the door behind me, peering out through the window, but the fog had swallowed everything. I couldn't see the street, let alone any figures. I sat on the couch, trying to calm myself down. I needed to get a grip. The ship had gotten under my skin, and now I was seeing things. Ghosts. Shadows. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But then, there was a knock at the door. I jumped, my pulse skyrocketing as I stood up. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I didn't open it. Instead, I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. Nothing. Just silence. I waited, holding my breath, wondering if I had imagined the knock as well. But then it came again. Slow. Deliberate. Knock. 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 I swung the door open, my heart in my throat, but no one was there. Just fog. Thick and endless. I shut the door, locking it again, my mind racing. Something was happening. Something had followed me back from the Nautica. The ship hadn't let me go. Not really. That night, the dreams started. I found myself back on the Nautica, standing at the bottom of the stairs, the metal walls groaning all around me. The air was thick with whispers, the same voices calling from the shadows. They took us. They took us. I tried to move, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. I was frozen, staring into the darkness, as the figures began to emerge. One by one, they stepped out of the shadows. Their faces were hollow, their eyes black pits of nothingness, and their skin hung loosely from their bones as if they had been drained of life long ago. They reached out to me, their fingers gnarled and bony, beckoning me to join them. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. The clock read 3:33 a.m. I was drenched, my heart hammering in my chest, the sound of their voices still echoing in my ears. But the worst part, the fog had seeped into my room. At first, I thought I was still dreaming, but no, it was real. Thick tendrils of mist curled around the edges of my window, sliding through the small gap at the frame. I could feel the cold dampness of it on my skin. I jumped out of bed, rushing to shut the window completely. As I pressed the frame down, I glanced outside, and that's when I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. Standing in the street, barely visible through the fog, their hollow eyes fixed on my house. On me. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The fog pressed in on all sides, choking the air from the room. And the whispering, God, the whispering was louder now. They took us. They took us. You're next. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I had to get away from whatever was happening. But as I moved toward the door, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The fog wasn't just outside. It was inside, too. And the figures, they were getting closer. I could feel it moving inside the house, seeping through the cracks in the windows, crawling along the walls like something sentient. My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen in the doorway of my bedroom, staring at the shifting tendrils of mist that curled and coiled around me. The figures outside were getting closer, their hollow faces barely visible through the fog that had swallowed the entire street. I could hear them now, whispers that scraped against my brain like nails on a chalkboard. They took us. They took us. You're next. I had to get out of here. Grabbing my coat, I bolted for the front door, throwing it open without thinking. The fog outside was thick, almost solid, but I didn't care. I ran, plunging headfirst into the mist, my heart pounding in my chest. The cold dampness of the air clung to my skin, making it feel like I was moving through water. The figures were everywhere, shadows lurking just beyond my vision, always one step behind, always watching. I could feel their presence pressing in on me, pulling me deeper into the fog. But I kept running. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. Away from the house, away from the ship, away from the suffocating presence that was dragging me back into the dark. I don't know how long I ran before I realized I had made it to the docks. The Nautica loomed in the fog, its rusted hull barely visible against the backdrop of swirling mist. I stared at it, gasping for breath, my heart racing in my chest. The ship stood there like a monument to everything that had gone wrong. The voices were louder now, the whispers mixing with the creaking of the ship, like the very metal was speaking to me. They took us. They took us. I should have kept running. I should have turned around and left this cursed place behind. But something held me there, something stronger than fear. I needed answers. The ship had called me back, and I was powerless to resist. I stepped onto the gangplank, my footsteps echoing through the still air. The fog seemed to part as I approached the ship, like it was inviting me in. The moment I set foot on the deck, I felt the weight of the ship press down on me again, the same crushing silence that had haunted me since my first visit. I wasn't alone. The figures were here too, lurking in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hollow, but they never moved. They just waited. I made my way to the stairs that led below deck. My hand hovered over the railing, hesitating for a moment. I had barely escaped last time, but now I didn't have a choice. Something was down there. Something that held the answers I was looking for. The voices grew louder as I descended, their whispers swirling around me, wrapping me in a suffocating cocoon of sound. They took us. They took us. I reached the bottom of the stairs, the cold metal floor groaning beneath my feet. The corridors were darker than before, the lights flickering overhead like they were struggling to stay alive. The air felt thick and oppressive, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. And then I saw it. At the end of the corridor, a door stood slightly ajar. I hadn't seen it before on my last visit. It looked old, older than the rest of the ship. The metal was corroded, rusted in places, but there was something else, something strange. Symbols, etched into the surface of the door. Symbols I didn't recognize. My heart raced as I approached it, my breath shallow. I could feel something behind the door, something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. I pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast. Far too vast to fit inside the ship. It was like I had stepped into another world. The walls stretched impossibly high, curving upward into an endless black void. The air was cold, far colder than it had been in the corridors. And in the center of the room stood a gateway. It was a massive archway, carved from the same dark metal as the ship, but it shimmered with an unnatural light. The symbols I had seen on the door were etched into the frame of the arch, glowing faintly. And beyond the archway was nothing, just a swirling void of darkness, shifting and roiling like a storm that had no beginning and no end. I took a step forward, drawn to the gateway like a moth to a flame. The whispers were louder now, coming from the arch itself, the voices rising in a cacophony of sound that made my head throb. They took us to the other side. I realized, with a sickening clarity, what had happened to the crew of the Nautica. They hadn't disappeared. They hadn't been lost at sea. They had been taken through the gateway, to the other side. But what was the other side? Another world? Another dimension? Something worse? I stepped closer to the arch, my hands trembling. I could feel the pull of the void, like it was reaching out to me, beckoning me to step through. The darkness beyond the arch swirled and shifted, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving within it. Something vast. Something alive. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here before it was too late. But as I turned to go, I felt the temperature drop even further. The air around me seemed to freeze, and the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, I felt it. A presence, standing behind me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The figures, the crew, they were there. Standing in the shadows of the room, their hollow eyes fixed on me. But they weren't like the shadows I had seen before. They were real. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their faces were twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes were empty voids, black and lifeless, and they were moving toward me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The gateway loomed behind me, the swirling darkness calling to me, and the crew in front of me, closing in. I was trapped. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The crew reached for me, their cold, bony fingers brushing against my skin, pulling me toward them. I struggled, but it was no use. They were too strong. And then, from the darkness of the archway, I heard it. A voice. Not a whisper this time. A voice so deep, so powerful, it made the walls of the ship tremble. "You are not supposed to be here." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, and the world around me began to blur. My vision darkened, the shadows of the crew closing in, and the last thing I saw was the swirling void of the gateway, reaching out for me. Darkness consumed everything. For a moment, I thought I was dead, trapped in the cold void between life and whatever lay beyond. The voice from the gateway echoed in my mind, the deep, thunderous rumble vibrating in my chest. "You are not supposed to be here." I opened my eyes. The figures, those twisted remains of the crew, were still around me, their hollow eyes locked on mine. But they had stopped moving, frozen in place like statues. The room was eerily silent. Even the gateway, with its swirling void, had stilled. Something had changed. I gasped for air, my heart pounding in my ears. The pain in my chest was overwhelming, as if an invisible hand was squeezing the life out of me. I stumbled back, desperate to escape, but the gateway was still behind me, radiating cold, pulling me closer. I glanced back at the figures, trying to gather myself, and that's when I saw it. Something had shifted in their expressions. It wasn't just the blank stares or the agony frozen on their faces. No. They were afraid. Afraid of what was on the other side of the gateway. I had to get out. I turned toward the door I had come through, but the way out was gone. The room stretched infinitely, a cavernous abyss with no walls, no ceiling. The only constant was the gateway, looming behind me like an ancient monument. Its presence felt alive. The whispers started again, louder this time. They took us. The voices were rising, surrounding me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The figures began to move again, slowly, their bony fingers reaching toward me, their mouths opening in silent screams. My body felt heavy, like something was pulling me down. The cold intensified as I struggled to stay on my feet. My head was spinning, the room warping around me. I couldn't breathe. The shadows of the crew closed in, the air thick with the smell of decay, their cold hands gripping my arms, my shoulders. And then, the voice from the gateway returned, louder and more menacing than before. "Step through." I froze. I understood now. The gateway wasn't just a passage, it was a trap. The crew hadn't vanished by accident. They had been taken by whatever existed on the other side. And now, it wanted me. I looked back at the void within the archway, feeling its pull like a magnetic force dragging me closer. I could almost see something in there, shapes moving in the darkness, flickering like distant stars. The crew's voices mingled with the deeper voice of the gateway, forming an unbearable chorus. "They took us. You are next. Step through." I tried to resist, but it was as if my body was no longer mine. My feet moved on their own, inching closer to the arch. The fog, the darkness, the ship itself seemed to fade away as I stared into the swirling void. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn back, to run, but it was too late. The closer I got to the gateway, the more I felt it. A presence. Something vast, ancient, and aware. It was watching me. Waiting. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold surface of the archway. The instant I touched it, the world exploded into light and sound. My mind was flooded with images. Memories, visions, things that weren't mine. I saw the crew, the moment they had first discovered the gateway, how they had been drawn in, unable to resist. I saw their terror, their confusion, as they were pulled into the void, never to return. And then I saw something else. Something darker. The gateway wasn't just a portal. It was a living thing. It fed on the souls of those who crossed into its realm, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment. The crew wasn't dead, not really. They were still there, somewhere on the other side, lost in the darkness, consumed by whatever force lived beyond the gate. It wanted me to join them. With a sudden burst of strength, I yanked my hand away from the arch. The cold grip of the crew released me, and I stumbled back, gasping for air. The figures, still surrounding me, seemed to flicker, their forms blurring in and out of existence. The whispers were deafening now, a chaotic swirl of voices and screams that made it impossible to think. The gateway pulsed, the darkness within it shifting, alive. I had to destroy it. I wasn't sure how, but I knew the gateway couldn't remain open. If I didn't stop it, more people would be taken. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. There had to be something, some way to close the portal and stop the nightmare. And then I remembered the symbols. The symbols etched into the door, the walls, the archway itself. They were the key. I didn't know how I knew, but I was certain. The symbols had been placed there to keep the gateway sealed, to keep whatever was on the other side from crossing over. But something had gone wrong, and the gate had opened. I raced back to the arch, ignoring the freezing cold that radiated from it. I reached out, tracing the glowing symbols with my fingers, feeling the energy pulsing beneath them. My hand moved on instinct, drawing lines, connecting symbols, completing patterns that I hadn't seen before. The air around me seemed to hum with power, the ground beneath my feet trembling as I worked. The crew's voices grew frantic, the figures closing in on me once more. I could feel their desperation, their fear. They didn't want me to close the gate. They needed it open. They needed me to fail. But I wouldn't. With one final stroke, I completed the last symbol. The air around me exploded with light, a blinding flash that sent me sprawling to the ground. I covered my eyes, the force of the blast rattling through my bones. The ship groaned, the walls shaking as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the gateway was gone. The arch still stood, but the swirling void within it had vanished, leaving nothing but cold, empty metal. The figures were gone too. The crew, the shadows, the whispers, they had all disappeared, as if they had never been there at all. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. The room was still vast, still impossibly large, but it was empty now. The oppressive weight that had filled the air was gone. It was over. I stumbled toward the door, my body aching, my mind still reeling from what I had seen. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just wanted to leave, to forget everything that had happened. As I stepped back onto the deck of the Nautica, the fog had cleared. The air was crisp, the sky above a dull gray, but it felt normal, real. The oppressive weight, the supernatural pull of the ship, it was all gone. But as I walked down the gangplank, something stopped me. A whisper. Faint, almost too quiet to hear. They took us. I froze, my blood running cold. They took us, and we took you. I turned, staring back at the ship, the cold metal gleaming in the dull light. For a moment, I thought I saw them again. The figures, the crew, watching from the shadows. And then they were gone. I walked away, leaving the Nautica behind me, the whispers still echoing in my ears.